structure with it, and this stuff really kind of makes it hard to maintain a team for more than a year. So if you got.
It's recording everybody.
All right, recording.
Okay,
Yeah.
we are recording.
We're going to call the meeting to order at 5:37 PM.
Bye.
With that, we do have quorum and no members of the public being present. So I'm going to close off the public portion. One small typo in the agenda. The only minutes for approval this evening are being from the March 12th meeting. Has everyone had an opportunity to read those minutes?
I don't.
Yes. Okay, I'm looking for a motion to approve, please.
So moved.
Second,
Second.
all in favor?
Aye.
Motion passed. School board member presentations, persons.
Nothing tonight.
Okay, with that, we'll close that. Superintendent comments. Again, let's revise our agenda. It still includes Dr. Bernier. It should be.
Yeah, I'm happy institutionally it's the seat, so I'll do that. Just really, just a tremendous appreciation for RSM. Had a chance to work through a few things with them. Some things you'll hear about later on. For example, Riverdale, we had kind of initial meeting, and our COO is being working with some of our staff to provide essentially managerial response, but just really appreciate the thorough nature of the work. It's always hard when you're trying to an organization that is actively working every single day to handle all the transactions, but set aside the time to do in-depth understanding of challenges that we encounter. And so just the respect that I have for the group and how well they've done to have those conversations while understanding those balancing needs, but also help to drive for us when they're getting the level of responsiveness they need from them to allow you to do your job effectively. It's just been such a privilege to support you all in the work and help and thank you for the continued learning that we have both now and in the future to continue to improve our performance. So just really appreciation is all I had to share in that. But I also would say ready to answer any questions on behalf of the audit committee from the administrative side if the committee would have any questions for me.
Are there any questions from any member of the committee? Hearing none, we'll close off that. Item number 7. Here's somebody at the door. I just want to make sure that there's no other member of the public. As we are being recorded, I'm going to request that at least the first time that you speak, you state your name first, and then go on with either your statements, your questions for RSM. I apologize in advance. I know it appears to be adversarial the way we're set up. It's more a matter of ensuring that everybody is captured on audio. With that, I'm going to leave it to RSM.
All right, Matthew Blondell, Director Internal Audit from RSM. Thank you for convening today. We're excited to run through 2 reports that we have for you. We have the Riverdale High School cost and schedule analysis, as well as a physical security report that we'll be walking through in closed session. So I've got members, the managers that led both of these engagements here with us. They're going to walk through the reports individually. I believe, Mr. Cohen, you said you wanted us to start with Riverdale?
Yes, please.
Perfect. Okay, so I'll hand it over to Chris Gumbs. He'll walk through the report, and then I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that you have as we're going through or at the end. As Dr. Savage noted, we don't have a manager's response incorporated into this report. They're going to be working to provide that, and we can certainly speak to this, it's kind of the conversations that we had in terms of their response, at least verbally. And then, like I said, we understand they'll be providing an official response prior to the board meeting for this report. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to Chris to walk through the report.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Chris Gumbs. I'm the RSM project manager for the Riverdale audit. Just a little bit of background on myself and our team. So I work very closely with Matt for school districts across Florida, mainly focusing on construction and capital programs. We've done similar analysis for other schools, for other school districts as well. So This is the first time you've been asked to come in and kind of tell the story of what happened with a project like this. So hopefully, this report kind of captures all the key points, as we set out this analysis. So before we get into the bulk of the report, I wanted to provide just a little bit of context on the audit. So this came as a result of a request from a board member through the previous superintendent. The board expressed some concerns about the overall cost of the Riverdale project, as some of you might know, and how the project kind of progressed throughout its life cycle and how cost was communicated. So the objective of our audit was really to tell the story of how the project progressed over its life cycle. How did they go from the original $41 million to the $110 million today? And to clarify, this was not a forensic audit of cost or schedule. That really wasn't what we were asked to do. We were tasked more of piecing together what happened, as I mentioned, and telling the story. I don't think anyone was questioning, did the district get what they paid for? Ultimately, I think, the parents, the students, and the community got a great school at the end of the day, or is getting a great school at the end of the day. But again, just trying to tell the story here. So I'll start on report page 2, the executive summary. So we'll skip past the transmittal letter and kind of get to the meat of this. So this section provides the spark notes for the report. We have a truncated background section, our objectives and scope, and also our overall summary. You'll note throughout that this report is structured a little bit differently than our traditional internal audit reports. We typically have observations and recommendations, and while that is still somewhat the case with this report, it's just structured a little bit differently, like I mentioned. So instead of observations, we have a results section, which is where we'll spend most of the time today, and that includes our key takeaways and recommendations from our analysis. But just to give kind of a high-level summary before we get to some of the following pages, our biggest takeaways, looking at the executive summary here, were that one, the initial $41 million budget for Riverdale was based on the amount of funding available at the time of project inception, not necessarily a detailed scope of work based on 100% construction documents. Two, the project followed a slightly different process than what is considered the normal process for large construction manager at risk projects, which is typically a phase 1 and phase 2 approach. Phase 2 for this project was segmented into 2 separate phases, phase 2A and 2B. And my understanding is that was done essentially for the benefit of the schedule to keep on track with that original August 2025 completion date. In addition to that, a large component of the cost increases, not surprisingly, had to do with the additions and modifications to the scope during design. So certain things were added, as the scope was being developed throughout the project, which may have resulted in additional costs, which we provide some detail in the results section. We also have a key takeaway for board communication. So based on our review of the board minutes, it appeared that key information related to cost and scope was brought to the board when operations was seeking approval of each of the different phases of the project. So at that point, the district had already gone through, the GMP and the subcontractor bidding process. And while that's standard, there was an additional level of cost for this particular project, which I can expand upon later on. Another component of that was the district received estimates from the architect during the design phase that basically estimated that the project would be upwards of $100 million. And based on what we were able to see through the board minutes, that figure was never formally communicated to the board until phase 2B was brought to the board for approval in March of 2024. We also acknowledge that the project started in quite possibly the worst possible time to start a construction project, right in the middle of COVID. So between 2020 and 2023, construction material and labor costs were skyrocketing. We've seen that at other projects and other jurisdictions as well, upwards of 30%, average increases. And for some materials, upwards of 80%. So that's certainly a factor in the cost as well. We also understand there was a significant turnover at the district during this time in both the superintendent and executive director of operations role. So all of that to say, all these different factors contributed to some of these concerns and challenges that have presented themselves through the delivery of this project. So I'll quickly walk through the background section and provide a quick summary. If you have any questions, feel free to jump in and ask. We can pause at any moment. So now I'm on page 3 of the report. So here we provide some background on the campus, the scope of the renovations, some of the key parties, and also the project costs. Moving on to the next page, we show the adopted budget over time. So you can see where the project started in terms of funding, starting in September of 2020, and where we are today. We also provide a breakdown of the cost by phase. So on this page, we have phase 1, and then it spills over to the following page as well. The phase 1 project cost estimate, that's for pre-construction or the design phase. As you can see in the table, the original phase 1 estimate was around $2.5 million. There were 2 subsequent revisions to that estimate, which were approved by the board in February and June of 2022. And you'll see in the change column on the far right, most of that $1.3 million increase for phase 1 was due to an increase in design fees for the architect. So as the scope expanded, that results in additional costs coming from the architect for them to update their drawings. I'm now on page 5 for phase 2A and 2B. We provide a similar breakdown. As I mentioned earlier, phase 2 was broken out into 2 separate subphases. So phase 2A, just for some background, included all of the site work for the project and the construction of a new gym and science building. Phase 2B focused on the interior renovations, so modernizing the facilities to bring it up to current code for mechanical, fire safety, that sort of thing, and also cosmetics as well. You know, it's a 56-year-old school at this point. So the figures you see in this table are what's called the total project cost estimate, which is essentially an itemized breakdown of the various costs that are presented to the board for approval. And that includes the different contract costs from the construction manager, the architect, the building official, and also it carries forward from the design phase as well. So that all kind of gets packaged together and is presented to the board, as one item as each phase is presented. On page 6, we provide a timeline of events. So this shows all the key milestones and decision points throughout the project lifecycle, when the budgets and total project cost estimates were approved by the board, but also when the architect issued their cost estimates as well, which will be important later on. Okay, so getting into the results section on page 7, like I said, we'll spend a little bit of time here and I'll provide a brief summary of each of these. This is where we expand on the key takeaways I touched on in the executive summary. First, we have board communication. So as I touched on earlier, part of the reason this analysis came to be was the board felt that to a certain extent, there was a lack of communication regarding project scope and costs. So what we did was we went through every single board meeting from 2019 to 2024 to date, and reviewed the meetings and isolated the meetings where Riverdale was discussed to figure out what was said, what was communicated throughout that time period. And our objective there was to kind of see the progression of the project as well and how it kind of developed over time. So based on a review of those board meetings and our understanding of when cost estimates were produced by the architect, it appeared that management to some extent was aware of the project cost that was likely going to cost $100 million. And that wasn't necessarily communicated to the board, at least formally, until more recently with the approval of phase 2B, as I mentioned. We also note in the report that the construction team previously provided monthly and quarterly capital project updates. So historically, Scott and the construction team and operations, they would come to the board every month and provide an update on all the various capital projects, talk about the current phase, the cost, et cetera. That process stopped in December of 2022. There wasn't really a reason explicitly stated as to why it stopped, but that is certainly a key consideration here. As you get into 2023, that's when these costs were really being developed. As you'll see in the recommendation, kind of staying in that same theme, we do believe there's an opportunity for the district to improve the communication to the board, specifically when it comes to scope and costs, and any potential cost increases during the design phase, without slowing down the process. The second key takeaway relates to the initial budget of the project. As we saw in the background section, the initial budget of the project was $41 million. That has since grown to $107 million through the last fiscal year. So the purpose of this takeaway is to highlight that The $41 million number was based on the available funding, as I mentioned, rather than detailed scope. And until you're in the design phase and you have estimates from your architects, it's really difficult to know with any sort of accuracy what a project is actually going to cost until you get subcontractor bids or you have that GMP estimate. You're not going to know with any sort of accuracy what the project could potentially grow to. Typically, this isn't necessarily outside of the norm. Riverdale is not unique in this. You typically have an initial budget and then you adjust over time as the design is developed. Another component of this was the methodology for designing Riverdale. From the start, if you go back, through the board meeting minutes, you'll see that the director of operations at the time, explicitly stated during board meetings, hey, we're going to do a full campus master plan, really look at the campus, see what it needs. What scope items do we need to include to bring, for one, the campus up to code, but also extend the viable life up to another 50 years. Key takeaway number 3, kind of zooming through this project delivery method. To provide a little bit more color to my comments earlier, back in 2018, 2019, the district came up with a standard 2-phase approach for their large construction projects. They developed this based on lessons learned from past projects. I heard somebody discussing Bonita Springs earlier. That was a case study for how this process was developed. So the goal for this process is to have, a strict phase 1 and phase 2 where you'd spend 6 months to a year of design, and then you would bring the total project cost to the board for approval once you have that fully developed design. And you'd have a good idea of what the project is actually going to cost at this point. With Riverdale, as I mentioned, construction was broken out into 2 phases, which essentially extended the duration of subcontractor bidding. So phase 2A was approved or brought to the board for approval in March of 2023. And then phase 2B was brought to the board in March of 2024. So you have a whole extra year to get subcontractor bids. And, as time progresses, inflation, market fluctuations, et cetera. So the key point here to kind of summarize is the departure from the standard 2-phase approach. It likely resulted in additional costs, but also some questions from the board as staff had to come back for that phase 2B. Key takeaway number 4, scope additions and modifications. In September of 2021, an initial estimate was provided by the architect based on the conceptual design, and that was in the amount of $56 million. About a year later, an updated estimate was provided by the architect for the 100% design development drawings for $91 million. So based on that information, it's pretty clear to say, something happened between September of 2021 and 2022 beyond just market escalation. And the architect actually, produced a breakdown that kind of detailed exactly what was added between that duration. The key takeaway number 5, I kind of already touched on this. We highlight the turnover to superintendent and executive director of operations role, and also the economic factors that likely affected the project as well. Let's skip down to page 13 for the recommendation. So our first recommendation, I think, addresses most of what we've highlighted in the results section. It relates to capital project updates. As I mentioned, they were previously doing this. So our recommendation for the district is to re-implement that process of providing regular updates to the board for ongoing projects. Going a little bit further than that, we also recommend that as part of that process, the district develop a standardized reporting template to essentially help provide a more structured update with specific information every single time. So for example, as I mentioned, as cost estimates are provided by architects at the various stages of design, update would include that information. So you clearly be able to see, for example, at 30%, if the estimate 60 million, you get to design development, it's 90 million. That provides the board with an opportunity to kind of assess, hey, we just jumped $30 million, what's going on here? Before the GMP is brought to the board. The second recommendation is pretty straightforward. We recommend where possible, follow the standard 2-phase approach. The district has this great process that I touched on, that was created to avoid instances like Riverdale and Bonita. So all we're saying here is to follow the process when you can. And if something comes up where a phase 2A and 2B is necessary, communicating that early on to the board, for full transparency. But I know that was a lot. I'm losing my voice here. So any questions I can answer?
I've got two. One is you have a feeling, I mean, it's gonna be hard to really define where the disconnect was, but was it the senior management changes? It just seems absurd that it would go from 40 million to 100 million. Like, do you think or feel that this was something someone didn't want to convey? Or is it just institutional miscommunication?
I think it's a combination of factors. I mean, the turnover certainly didn't help. Things are discussed, with a certain superintendent, and then there's a knowledge transfer that may or may not occur.
Yeah.
So again, with a lot of the staff and superintendents not being here anymore, it's difficult to kind of understand like what was said in the past during those meetings. So Matt, do you have any comments on?
I mean, I think ultimately, and that's kind of where we're driving with the recommendations is regardless, so that you don't lose that institutional knowledge or you don't lose if there are decisions that are being made, because we also understand that that management should have some autonomy to manage a project, and the board shouldn't necessarily be involved at every step of the way, but that there should still be clear communication as to what's going on and what decisions are being made at a point in the process that the board can, if they would wish to, have that discussion, perhaps provide some input. So that's really what we're driving towards, and I think that structuring the capital project updates to happen again more regularly and having a specific set of information that's provided to the board, we think would provide that transparency.
Yes.
As to specific cause, like Chris said, it's hard to say.
It's impossible. And I think what's interesting, I guess the second question then is, I would suspect that a lot of these additions, because there's a lot of them, and they all look pretty important. I suspect they were probably discovered as they were going through the process. Oh, we got to fix this. So then it's just a matter of, do we do this and we don't ask for more money, we just kind of commit to it. So, but yeah, it does seem like an elegant solution. Just here's the board's given monthly updates. Here's the scope.
And that's kind of where I kind of want to focus in on, right? Because it looks like when we read this, that the majority of all of your increases, we're talking from the initial 56 million. So it went from 41, that's what we have funding for. 56, that's your high level ROM, to 91 after you did detailed, and that 56 to 91 was associated additions modifications.
Right.
Sounds like there's really no board level oversight of, hey, we have these additions that are X millions of dollars. Like, is there no going back to the kitty to kind of get confirmation? Is this addition worth the additional $5 million? Yes, you want them autonomy, but at some point, if you have additions over X threshold of budget, I would imagine that should go back to the board to understand, at least from visibility standpoint, we have these additions and they're going to cost millions upon millions of dollars of extra money.
Right.
Like a change, it's like a change order.
Yeah, so the unique advantage is I was here the entire thing, right? So the challenge that you get to when you get to the beginning and all the way through is I think they've done an excellent job laying out probably the best criteria is just the timeline itself and the dollar values. So that you have a clear sense of what was known, when, and at what time. That's probably the most valuable piece of information. Then the narrative piece, just to try to add color so that it's clear how that works. There's subtle things when you have a leadership changeover, like for example, you understand the phase construction process was designed absolutely as a response to Bonita High and huge escalations beyond what they agreed upon. So that's why the phase construction process was developed. But why was the capital update process done monthly? Precisely for the reasons that they've uncovered. So that there was ongoing engagement, because while the board does act upon the design, the full design totality, but as we saw in this particular example, this was done as a master campus design. Why? Because they wanted to understand. We don't necessarily know all the needs, and we may discover different needs as we look at them. As we kind of look at this, maybe today we would think this, but it isn't simple. It's actually seeing how it all works together, knowing that parts of that campus were designed at different times of the life of that campus. And so you're really trying to take different ages, different structures, different profiles, all those pieces and pull those things together. So taking the time to do that master plan to try to put together so that if you wanted to do phase construction, you couldn't do it all at once because you don't want to disrupt the school operation and inhibit its ability to do it. You may do chunks of it at certain times. But precisely as you see, and they've laid it out, I just think very effectively, the different things that were added in phase 2A and phase 2B. But all those things occurred that year of additions of additional pieces that there wasn't any administrative change over at that time. There was, that same folks, but the process that communicated this had been taken away, as they noted, December of 22, when we stopped doing those updates. Now, why that was done, I can't tell you specifically why Scott was no longer permitted to address the board that way, but precisely why Scott doesn't and gives this, the change order is, and they actually do exactly what you suggested. I don't know if you were aware of this, but the 30% design drawings, all those things were part of that update. So that as they're being done by an architect, as you're getting that finality, the board has that awareness to escalate before they're given a firm decision point, which is, we put in the board's responsibility. Yes, we have our design drawings. Do you want us to proceed to the next phase or not? That is a hard decision, but prior to that, all those updates were designed for them to have information, inquire, hear progress, challenges, escalations, all those things. So by that whole process being gone, presumably that information is being given to the board members via a private one-to-one, so forth. But publicly, the reason why we've done as a public update is for that exact reason. It's memorialized, it's there, all those pieces. Now, I just happen to be here for all that, but I would say if you go date by date, it really tells its story. It may be hard to follow. It's not necessarily easy to follow, but it's one of the things, if you just kind of see that piece, the first initial description of the funding is exactly correct. This was the amount of money that was set aside in the budget, knowing that there would be some ability to say, we're going to do a more complex or less complex scope of work based on that master site plan. So maybe 41 million is all we have, and we're gonna have to fit within that budget. Or maybe we will have additional dollars at a later time. But that's why the first stage master plan was developed to really understand the needs, the capacities, those things, and then you see how it played out from there. But again, there was turnover, changes in COOs, changes in superintendents, changes in a lot of things. And some of these structures were designed to support it, just went away. They were, and I can't speak to why they were taken away. I can't answer that. But you can see where we landed. The big escalation that you kind of talked about between the 60, to 60 million to this huge gap here, it's 56 to the 91. That all happens though during one administration. So I can't say if that was communicated to the board, but I know that it happened within that given year. So I just don't know. I don't know the answer. I wasn't in that role to see it, and I don't know because it wasn't in the public. There were the updates had ended at that point. So was that communicated to board members? I'm not sure, but certainly what that reflects, that big jump in change, is what you see listed below. The phase 2A and 2B, which, as Butch mentioned, spells out what were the specific changes in scope that are derived from that change. That's where that, in addition to whatever other market realities were, but then you can see the significant changes that were made and so forth during that time period. So I hope that helps, because they did really lay it out by time, but happy to answer anything else. We will have official management response of what we recommend kind of reacting to it, but that's not what this is intended to do, just to try to make understanding so we aren't, misreading what the data, what we're seeing.
Mr. Sun, did you have any questions you wanted, please?
I did. In regards to the scope changes, with 100+ campuses in the district, and new construction renovations being relatively common, it seems like some of these scope changes should have been foreseen when we're looking at like student population counts. I mean, the district is forecasting decades out to understand where population is. Is there anything in what you guys uncovered to suggest if this was just a shortcoming of those projections? Or why are we having 20% increases in capacity in some buildings, 30% increase in parking, when you would have hoped those would have all been taken into consideration? And what increase in cost did that add, having that happen through the process instead of in the initial phase A planning?
So the short answer is that we did not look at student count or go into depths on, why certain things were increased. The number of seats in a gym were increased, for example. But I do know, we know in the report here, for example, the parking spaces, they were increased from 592 in the initial design plans to 774. My understanding is that was a request from the school. So a lot of this comes directly from the school, not necessarily, the student enrollment numbers. I know that's a consideration, of course. But regarding the conversations that were happening in the background as to why, I don't think we can speak on that, unfortunately.
Mr. Chair, if I could just.
Yes.
Or Dr. Savage.
But Mr. Sun, go and then you'll be able to.
For this, I think part of then what I would hope to see management take into consideration, and this is going to just notifying the board and making sure there's open communication there, is looking at process here, because I can't imagine, well, there's some socioeconomic difference across the district, the percent of high schoolers which are driving to to our high school campuses is going to be relatively consistent. And so we can understand and allot for some change. We may be, 50, 100 spots off, but 30% increases seems pretty drastic. And it seems like if that's the case, there may be some disconnect between decisions being made here and the reality on the ground in schools.
For comment, I would say that part of the design process, and I can't speak to, I wasn't involved at this stage of it. What I would say is there is an attempt to involve in the process, school-based leadership, district-based leadership. And the idea is a give and take between district quality control of having folks like your director of construction or project managers that are ensuring that some of those key systems across the system looking at it are addressed, but also that there's always informed really with the design, whether it's the architects. Specifically, there's criteria they're utilizing rather to ensure that they aren't, as they're analyzing the site, analyzing the need, that if that's usually being driven by the professionals who are doing part of this work. And usually that's listed in the scope as something they have to do in this particular case because it's a master plan. I just can't speak the specifics of why that school request was given, whether it was in fact validated by professional drawings and estimates of what would be needed or not. But on like a new, by contrasting that, like a new school build, it's all driven by student capacity numbers, by exactly the cost per student station, whereas something like this, where you're actively going to be remodeling and completely renovating and changing some of the purpose of your space, that could be very different. But again, architects are involved in every step of that as well. So that's the best way I can answer that, and to say that part of the process is having those school-based people and those district people together, but not necessarily giving one person the upper hand. If that makes sense.
And if I could just add too, that we've had some policy changes going back to 2023 for change orders, architecture, design, that also impacts that, but it was after the fact that those policies came into.
Mr. Severson?
Yeah, Jim Ward. I guess what jumps out at me initially is the comment that you made about the fact that the budget was built on the basis of available funds, not on the cost of the project. I mean, that to me is a recipe for disaster right from the get-go. So the second thing that concerns me was whether or not the $40 million number, and I'm not sure who would necessarily address this to, but was the $40 million number built such that it could be accrued rather than trying to get a $100 million project approved? $40 million project being much easier to get approved than a $100 million project. I understand the scope of what happened, project creep, all that stuff, financial background. I've seen it all over the years. I've actually worked with RSM on club manager projects. I know Tammy Tomasano and Phil Newman very well, worked with them on a number of different projects. But that's in addition to the comments that have already been made, which I agree with. From a 10,000 foot perspective, that would be my concern.
The other members of the committee?
Mr. Chair, I'll just to tack onto that. I think one of the concerns that I have is if we look at how that creep occurred rather rapidly and without the transparency to the board, I think when you look at the cost of building a completely brand new school, state of the art, I mean, we're pushing near those costs. And I'm concerned that the board just was never given the opportunity to debate that idea of, we have an old facility that needs a lot of work. Do we start from scratch and does that give us a 100-year facility instead of getting this 50-year-old facility another 50 years? And so that's, I think, some of what we'll hope to hear addressed in management's response.
I might just ask one other
Yes,
question.
Mr.
On page 3, you have a construction cost going from 47 million to 77 million, increase about 30 million. You have an actual breakdown of that 30 million, where it occurred somewhere?
We do not have a breakdown or an itemization of the cost. You said on page 3,
Yeah, I'm sorry, page 5. Which line item? The second line, construction costs on the second line where you have phase A, 2A, 47 million, phase B, 29 million to a total of 77. What the actual itemization of that 29 million might be.
So we don't put it in the report, but Matt, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, the GMP would break that down to a line item basis.
It should, and I think at a high level,
Phase 2B on
Yeah.
page 12.
yeah, that's where I was
Has,
going.
it has the changes, right, the modifications, but it doesn't have what else was part of there.
Right,
So these were the additions that helped lead to that 29 million number.
correct. On page, the top of page 12, the bulleted items, they're not quantified,
Okay.
but
Well, that's what I was looking for, is more of a quantification.
I mean,
We have a quantification from the architect.
So help me understand how GMP works in this environment where you have such an increase.
so. Could you be more specific?
Guaranteed maximum price.
Right.
You hire a GC, you hire some contractors, they give you a GMP.
Right,
They're supposed to hold to that GMP.
right,
Some are at risk, some are not at risk.
right.
But generally speaking, you want to stay within some guardrails of what that GMP is gonna be.
Sure, and that's where the departure from the two-phase system to the three-phase system, I think that's what answers your question, because 2A was its own GMP and 2B was its own GMP. So instead of starting out early and saying, what's it gonna be for the whole scope, and then getting a GMP and then moving from there and saying, so that it's known upfront exactly what the whole cost is gonna be, it was parsed into A and B.
And to clarify, the increase in cost wasn't a result of change orders. This was all occurring within design.
Right, give me a perspective from the board, and maybe that might be good here, communication wise. I knew that a phase 1 for Riverdale had been approved before I got on the board. We had 3 new board members out of 7, so it's almost half. And we came in, before I was even on the board, they had revised it up to 64 million. So not knowing what that phase 1 number was, when they came and said, okay, we're ready for phase 2. I figured it was already built into the design. I mean, so when you have the communication, you have to take in, you also had new board members as well as turnover from staff there. And then when they come back and say, okay, now we have a 2B. Well, first off, I don't remember a 2A. I just remember phase 2. So I was a little bit, and I said, well, I know we have phase 1, phase 2. That was probably always built into the price. My understanding was way back when they did phase 1, it was always going to be over $100 million or close to it. And that figure really wasn't presented to the board that at that time they said, well, we started off at 40 million and now we want 100 million. I think the board, I know I would have questioned it. Because I didn't realize the whole timeline here. So I think we need to not only do a better communication, but you got to realize you have new people coming on the board. We're going to have at least 2 new board members coming on in November. So they won't understand any of this. And that's a whole difficult thing that we have to learn to communicate and bring them up to speed on that. I feel very comfortable now, but I felt very comfortable when I approved the phase 2B, as if it was meant to be. It was recommended by the superintendent. And I can understand where the money was going. I looked at that. And I think the other board members did too. But I just didn't like finding out later that it was originally supposed to be a $40 million project. And now looking at this, I don't think it was ever meant to be a $40 million project. I think it was always meant to be close to a $100 million project. And I think the previous board members should have been maybe told that right off the bat. If they said, okay, we're going to do it in 2 phases, a 40 million phase and a $60 million, that would be fine too. I don't have a problem with 2 guaranteed phases, but you got to let them know up front, the board, that that's what you're looking at, I think, rather than just all of a sudden. It just seems like phase 2B came out of thin air, and that bothered me a little bit. That's why I was really happy y'all looked into this and did this.
I'm going to let my colleagues continue, and then I'm going to take up the tail end of this. Mr. Sun?
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of Mr. Persons there, I think that's sort of a two-stage process. One is the responsibility of the district to get the information to the board. And then the question on the cost inevitably falls to the board and then the citizens of the county to say, did the board make a wise fiduciary decision or did they not? I think in some ways, the board may be handicapped in that because the voters are still going to hold them accountable to the final number. And they were trying to make decisions without all the facts. And so as we get that update, I'll just be curious if, I know we mentioned some templates. Is that something that's been provided to management?
You absolutely can.
We actually had some during our prior board updates, we'd actually break them down by phase, by different percent design drawings and where they were. It was a standardized template just so that the board could follow along with it because it was difficult. Right? Or what phase were they? How far into construction were they? What were the percent? I mean, all those aspects were designed to be standardized. And then just when the board update went away, all that went away with it. So we could certainly re-engage what we used to do, but also we could look and have feedback of how they could even be enhanced. But they do address a lot of the things that have already been said. We could even provide some samples of what those were because it was comprehensive. It was all the major capital projects in the district every month so that any question could be asked on any of them, wherever they are, because as you can imagine, they're constantly changing. But it's also the change orders were simply brought just to show change in material costs as an addition. But that was really the change order aspect of the presentation was really the most minor. The actual capital update was the most substantive. It was also an opportunity to escalate things that are noteworthy, massive changes in scope, anything for that exact reason. So the board could contemplate because that's the idea. And that was part of the challenge of it. I also the comment that was made about the 40 million that originally was budgeted. I believe, again, because it was going back in time, but from my understanding, it was at the end of that 5-year process because beyond the 5 years, you can continue to add to that capital dollar. The value, I think, even in what was initially communicated, was that it would very likely exceed that amount. So that knowledge was there. The challenge was the board may only have so much money. And so as they do a master plan, part of the thought of the master plan, just based on my recollection, I want to validate that in course in the documentation is, they may find they can't do all the things they'd like to do. That there may be budget realities that will bind you, but you would have that opportunity prior to completion of 100% design drawings to know this is what we are and aren't going to do based on what's available, because the campus itself was unique in terms of where they moved. They did a significant amount of site movement where they had parking in one location and acquired additional property. And that I wasn't involved in the later stages when the gigantic increase occurred, but I can say that I just know the complexity of it, even at the outset, was such that they wanted to allow for some room so that as they would have those conversations, but again, that was all done within the understanding of the current process that we had at that time, which was frequent communication with the board on a monthly basis. My understanding is that at some point it was taken down to quarterly and then it was taken away altogether. Those templates still exist. Those things would give you some insight into how information had been conveyed so that the board had more ongoing understanding. And as Mr. Percival mentioned, there was a changeover in the board as well. So there wouldn't have been that even institutional understanding of what had been communicated prior so that they wouldn't even know to ask for those templates and so forth, which do break it down by phase, by design, by cost, status, challenges, all those aspects. But all great questions and all good, I think, important piece of feedback so far.
Can I add one thing? And I'll be quick about it, but maybe like a best practice. It seems like the architect was one person that had relatively accurate numbers the entire time. I mean, the architect submitted September 2022, it's going to be $91.1 million or 91.2. And 6 months later, the board is approving $69 million. So we've got a $22 million gap there where, so, maybe just having the architect in front of the board quarterly or something like that, just because if Florida continues on its current path, realistically, construction's not going to get cheaper. And as that number evolves, seems like God bless him for knowing what construction costs are, but the architect sure seemed to have a pretty good handle on what the costs were. So,
Any of the other members?
It's almost a question. It's back to the Nixon era. What did the board know and when did they know it? It's, if they knew that this 40 million was phase one and that phase 2 and phase 3 were coming, but they only had $41 million in the budget to work with within that period of time, and that's what they approved, fully knowing, based on what the architect said or whatever else, that the project, not so much that it's gonna have project creep. It was designed to be an increase of up to $100 million, but the board only had $41 million at the time to, budget to it. So it gives a little bit of a different perspective if the board knew where it was going as opposed to being completely blindsided by it. That to me is a very different perspective.
Anyone else? Hey, I don't know if I have quite the history as Dr. Savage, but I go back to Benita High School. When I read this report, it took everything in my power not to reach through my computer screen and try to throw it out the window. After the Benita fiasco, which went significantly over budget, and the school board took a lot of heat for it, Instruction Advisory worked in conjunction with several others to put a flow chart together with controls. They then presented that to Finance Advisory, on which I sat. I found at least 8 holes in that. Was advised by the individuals who were in the room at the time, don't worry, our procedures will make up and cover it, but also recognize that we don't have staffing to fill all those holes. Now what we've done is we've increased the number of controls. We have an oversight committee over sales tax. This doesn't happen around that independent process. Somehow that independent process was missed during this. They have to now go back and justify how we went $70 million over the initial approved budget. And with the independent review and oversight over sales tax, that's going to come up for renewal. And it's going to be it was not an easy win to get the sales tax. Because that recommendation came out of Finance Advisory, and it was a hard fight for the school board to get it through. With something like this coming through, luckily we're not a couple of years down the road. Because I can guarantee you, I don't think the sales tax will pass if they see this. Because the mindset of the public is going to be, they have $70 million that they can play with now, so they really don't care. It's going to come from sales tax, and tourism will pick up, and the money will always be found, and it's the tax and spend concept. As I said, we were committed at those meetings that there will be proper oversight. There is not. Just for everybody's benefit, Benita went over budget because they used outdated construction cost numbers. They didn't take into account current numbers. They were using numbers, I believe, that were almost 5 years old. The cost of materials at the time. To try to lay the blame now that COVID kicked in and the hurricanes kicked in and the supply chain kicked in, that should have been represented to the school board that, guys, we know we originally came to you with $40 million. There's no way we're going to be able to stick to budget on $40 million, leaving the architect completely out of the equation. We're talking 5 years from inception of this to completion of this project. Do we know what 2024 is going to bring during hurricane season? $108 million may not be the line in the sand. We have a significant impact from hurricane, whatever is going to come in 2024, and potentially even early in 2025. This could be $150, $160 million project. How's the school board going to feel about having that presented to them? And they've already committed to a lot of those dollars going out the door. I'd like to understand who authorized these change orders. I know we had changed in administration through the way. How the school board was not notified about these changes in the architectural plans. Why Mr. Persons thought that this is all a single phase project. You have one school board member that's acknowledging it. We have several other school board members who may or may not be privy to it. Why was this not disclosed after 2022 to the school board members? What was going on? That's the same thing that happened at Benita High School. Information was not related to construction advisory because they got their heads handed to them. The school board, it was not a fun election. I'm sure Mr. Persons, you probably remember those days of when the school board election happened. There were individuals who were called to task. Sadly, we're in a position now, and not sadly, but We are in a position now where our superintendent is an elected position. The public is gonna have access to this. Are they gonna feel confident in whoever the candidates are gonna be for superintendent and say, you're part of the old regime? Do we trust you to be part of the continuation in oversight of the school district? Or do we bring in somebody from the outside and start fresh? How much do we trust those 2 open seats on the school board? Do we bring in outsiders who have never really been involved in the school district who say, use this? I'm shocked we don't have a packed room tonight. I guarantee you, once this gets out, that school board meeting is gonna be a packed room. When the public hears that there's a $70 million minimum overage on the construction of this school, and my colleagues were absolutely correct when they said potentially a new school could have been constructed for same price, possibly less, and to all standards, including hurricane standards, operating as a shelter, and other opportunities that we had there. It's a tough sell to go back to the public and say, we were gonna do an upgrade to a school that we know is older, and $40 million was gonna save the taxpayers money. Now going back and saying, well, we could have really built a new school, but yeah, it just got away from us, and now we're at $108 million. And sorry, taxpayers. I'm trying to hold my composure. Most of my composure left me when I saw this report the first time. What I am going to be looking for RSM is a really deep dive into the responses we get from management. I'm going to say it as audit committee chair, and I'm also saying it as a taxpayer. I want feet held to the fire. The feet were supposed to have been held to the fire after Benita. Obviously, something happened over the course of 7 years for us to be back in that same position and even worse. That's a problem. I understand that there was change, but most of us come from the business world. We have change in staff. We document what the prior person did so that the incoming person has an idea of what's happened before, why it happened, and to move forward without somebody having to stand over their shoulder. And reiterating, this is why we now do things the way we do them now. That's why we have procedures. That's why they should be in writing. That's why they should be documented. We, as an audit committee, should not be reviewing every set of procedures, but I'm going to ask and make sure that within scope of audits on a going forward basis, and I know you do it, if they have a written procedure, we better make darn well sure that if there is any reason why they're not following procedure, that a letter of the procedure, why the change? And if it's a matter of we have less staffing and we have to change the control, that's for you gentlemen to make that determination as to if that is still a valid control in place. And any other control that they decide that they want to either waive, modify, or adjust. I want to leave it to your discretion. And if you feel uncomfortable enough that they're doing things wrong, no, you should not be in a position where saying you need to hire 5 more people so you have the controls in place, but there needs to be that hard discussion. And the school board absolutely should be apprised of control breakdowns along the way, because this is, to me, is the tip of an iceberg. We have a lot of construction projects coming down the pike. We don't know what the next project will bring. And we don't have $70 million in this district to play around with, especially when the media now is jumping and saying that our teachers are the lowest paid in the 3 counties of Collier, Charlotte, and Lee. And now for somebody to get this and say, well, they found $70 million to overspend on a school, but they can't find an extra $10,000 for a teacher. And that was the fight that we had during the sales tax. Everybody assumed that the sales tax money was going to be used for operating benefit purposes, and it was really for capital. The public still may not grasp, and they're not going to read thoroughly enough to understand that it's only for capital improvement. And they're going to make the assumption that that's $70 million that was thrown away by the district that could have been used to bring in better quality teachers, more teachers, address the school bus driver issues and other issues within the district. Have I said, Mr. Davis?
Yeah, you mentioned something and it triggered a question in me. So the director of construction previously was apprising the board about kind of statuses and all this, right? That stopped December 22. We have a construction advisory committee as well. Is there still appraisals going from the director of construction to the construction advisory committee on a periodic basis?
I saw the breakdown in your report, if I may. I saw a breakdown from reading your report that construction advisory was not even notified. And Mr. Persons, you're the liaison to construction advisory. I don't know if
You
you
haven't gotten deep into any of this.
So I think that's another kind of thing that you need to consider. So yes, surprising the board's one thing, but that's the whole concept of the advisory committees is being able to get an initial oversight and then also update the board with red flags. So I think that's something that needs to be addressed as well, if they're not being brought up to speed.
and finance advisory at that.
Yeah,
Finance advisory is not only responsible for income source, but also expense recommendations. They had made a number of income recommendations through the years. They also got very bent out of shape in 2017 when they heard about the Benita High School overage. Because they worked very hard and diligently on naming rights and other means of income into the district, and then to find out that money was mismanaged. And that was what the public called it. I'm not saying it myself, that's what the public called it at the time, is problematic.
One other throwaway in my just organic experience with the school district and leadership and across the spectrum of departments. I feel like educators should not be leading construction projects, finance stuff. Get subject matter experts. It shouldn't be a history teacher that's running a construction project. I mean, I can be totally off base, but I've seen a lot of this where I used to be a third grade teacher. Now you're ahead of some, $100 billion division of this $2 billion organization. You're not a subject matter expert. You're a great teacher. And it's just the district kind of moves people up and it's not always necessarily appropriate where they end up. So that's just the throwaway is just an organic question of, does some of this come from just lack of expertise? They don't know how to convey, they don't know how to anticipate, they don't know who to go to when problems arise because it's outside of their typical professional scopes.
I'd like to add one more thing. This Riverdale project, probably close or maybe a little more than half of it is brand new construction. Brand new gym, brand new science lab. We had a lot of portables. There are more portables than any other school. They all are going to be now new classrooms. So there is a lot that has been brought totally up. But then that left a good part of the old school that has to be all renovated with all the, and it says in here, all the things that have to be done. And you're right, it might have been cheaper to tear the old part down and start over. I don't know. But I didn't want you to everybody to think that the whole thing was just only renovation. I mean, there's a lot of brand new, right up to hurricane standards and everything else, especially the gym. Gym is just a huge part of it.
But we also know, going back, that there were a considerable number of Band-Aid fixes that happened at a number of the schools before we had the funding in place to do the repairs appropriately. And granted, a decent percentage of the work being done to this high school is newer or new. $70 million could have gone a long way to taking care of a lot of those Band-Aid fixes at a number of the other schools along the way. They could have scaled back. Maybe they needed $90 million to do this. That's still almost $20 million that could have been reallocated to other schools from the sales tax dollars. That's where my frustration. I'm not saying that $40 million should have been the end all, but for us to get from 40 million initially all the way up to $108 million, and nobody taking into account that there are other schools that have needs, and only applying it to Riverdale is problematic. And this is just me speaking, the school board ultimately has a say in it, but I think that we need some additional oversight over any of these construction projects on a going forward basis so that we do not get blindsided again. We've now had 2 learning curves. I don't want to be around for the 3rd time we have a learning curve.
Almost like RSM providing a valuable service. Have a third-party construction project manager, or, you know, like if this is outside of if you're over 2 in big high school, maybe consider hiring a third-party construction, management firm or something, just.
And just
Yes,
with all due respect, I just want to, appreciate a lot of, there's the actual response to the facts and there's like some speculation. Teachers being involved, at no point is a teacher involved in any part of this process. And really, the principal is just a member of the team, is the only person who's even remotely close to that piece. The other folks are all construction professionals who did it. In fact, the people originally recommended the design were experienced municipal planner, with it also the school, experienced school-based planner. So, you have the architects providing all these, but I think the key is, Bonita High was an experience that many of us lived through. The administration that went away with the monitoring procedure, that took away all the things that they recommended, all those things were in place and they all disappeared from this process. Because the people who were in that position didn't understand why they existed. Were never a part of the Bonita High. They didn't understand why Mr. Rickenbacker was monthly updated. They didn't understand why that was in place. They didn't understand the phased construction process either, to be quite honest, and why are you doing it this way? What was communicated and when, with dollars involved, part of it is we involve the board with greater frequency than many districts, as you'll find, specifically so that the board has the opportunity to say, yes, no, go back, do it again. Those things are done intentionally, as opposed to a situation where that isn't the case, because we want that work. What it does also memorializes for everyone the changes in cost, the changes in scope, the changes at the various times where it was formally recognized, and you see that laid out here in front of you. So the downside is, because we are bringing and formalizing those things more with greater frequency, any change in that dollar value, it gives this appearance that, in fact, what was known when and by whom and what was the preconceptions that they had at the time. I just want to make sure it's very clear that because we are putting more of those things in front of the board, any variance in that is also, if you're covering a significant period of time. So I did go back to the original $40 million was placed in that piece. That was prior to any formal design drawings being done, which as part of that process, they knew absolutely you're going to do this. And once you do it, you get the first design drawings, and then by that piece, you now have a $64 million piece. So you've changed. Yes, that's 24 million, but that's because of the initial estimate, which was absolutely based on no design drawings whatsoever and no real knowledge of exactly what they were going to do on that particular campus and what changes they're making. They had rough, you can see the specific things that were in the scope document. It wasn't until they actually went in and did that piece, and that gives the board a chance to react to that. Do we want to proceed with this 64 million, which included both phases, or not? Then what you see is significant changes based on what was done there. You see significant additional phases, all done within that time period, all of which are communicated with the updated costs. And so I understand it's a big jump, but that's what it describes. So I want to make sure we're saying the money that was paid contributed to what you actually saw that was either constructed or under construction. All of that work is described there. So it's not like one could evaluate whether or not was it too high of a cost and so forth, but all the changes that were done, it's memorialized in time so you can see them. That doesn't mean that there was a promise made at the beginning and then it just dramatically changed. Each of those things were brought back for additional consideration. Now, the part that I can't attest to, I can't say, was between that major change where all those additional scope elements were added, and that, of course, would increase dramatically costs as well. What level of engagement the board had in that conversation? Were they on board with additional, $40 million of work? Was that sufficient? Was it unavoidable? I don't know. I wasn't a part of this conversation. I can't say, but I can say that the fact that you see so many dates and times memorialized of board where board has a chance to approve, disapprove, or not. That was all done in transparency, so that it isn't wondering what the board knew. This is when the board acted. This is what the information was conveyed. The only period of time I can't attest to is that year where there was, but again, management response, we'll get into that detail. The recommendations they've made, were actually practices that we had already in place before. And so that's part of what I can say from a basic management response is, that's why we put it in place to avoid the Bonita High. I can't tell you why it was taken out, why it was done. I just don't know the answer to that question. I don't know. Or I would tell you today, but I can't because I was not part of this conversation of why we took this away. Was it efficiency? Was it some byproduct of hurricane? I just don't know. I hate to speculate, but it wasn't a teacher that was making the call. They were always under the same director of construction was there for the entirety of this process, the same one. So he'll be a valuable member of answering what direction was given to him, because the same person who lived through Bonita is still here today. The same person who briefed the board back then. Pardon?
He's the one who created it.
Absolutely. And he is a construction management professional. His whole career he's been spending in these. And that's why he was the one updating and not a teacher. He's not any of those things as well. So it's just really, I understand it's an emotional issue. I understand it's significant. I understand the gravity of sales tax. I get all those pieces, but I also don't want to overreact to what they've spelled out for you is a lot of information. And I just don't want to be misinterpreted by the audit committee of, trying to fill in the gaps of what I'm understanding or what I'm thinking I'm seeing versus the management response, which will hopefully articulate and add some color to direction, but also just what we'll do to put in place. I feel it's really important that we don't, I get it, I understand it, believe me, I get it. I really appreciate the fact that we don't want to reduce taxpayer confidence in those pieces, but I also would say, let's have an opportunity for folks to just give a response on this that gives the detail of the things that are biggest concern to me, which is that massive change, what level of communication occurred, but also we can attest what things we want to put in place were actually the things they're recommending were things that we had in place. And I'll show you the templates. I don't expect you to say that word for it. We can show you exactly what was in front of the board. Those are all public record. They're there. And you can review them. You can see them in totality. I don't know if you all had a chance to look at any of our prior capital updates that actually broke down all the things that they were asking were all in place in those updates.
Just to clarify, the same construction project manager with Bonita and River.
No, the same construction director, the director of construction, Scott Rickenbauer, has been through and is wanting to put that process in place to prevent these type of things. He's still here, but that doesn't mean he unilaterally made the call to change this piece. I'm confident he did not, but I would rather say, because there have been lots of changes in people who supervise Mr. Rickenbacker. I say that because many of the same project managers, one of them in particular, was here through those instances as well. So I just say that because there were those same people. They actually will have a lot of insight that they can give. I just want to be able to give that a chance to get that response so that you are able to react to that, as opposed to we're guessing. I just don't want to do that. I think that type of speculation just makes the situation worse.
Mr. Davis?
Just so from an audit committee perspective, do we have a rough idea of timeline of when we could expect that management response? Because I'll be interested to look into it. And you're right, that use that to color our response. Normally with an audit report, you get the response and that kind of helps us understand.
We just received, there wasn't sufficient time for them to draft. The other piece is I would be happy to have the folks who speak to you. I mean, not only could you get a response that we put in writing, but you'd be able to probe and ask questions, because what I don't want you to do is an oversight group is to feel that you're having to fill in the gaps. I want you that we have access. I can't bring Dr. Bernier. I can't have that. I can't bring his former COO who was here, who stepped in that piece. I can't bring any of those folks and ask why they went away from the process. I can't say that. But I can bring people who were there who have been there through all of it, because they can tell me, well, here's a deviation we made. I will tell you from what they've explained to me in the digging they did in interviewing, as well as all this piece, the information predominantly is laid out here. The few gaps that are wonderings, I think that's what we want to make sure we identify that, we take accountability for those things, and we put in safeguards for future projects as well. So, I mean, that's the best that I can think of in the moment. But I saw the emotions being raised in this, and I totally understand that. I just didn't want us to jump to conclusions that you won't have some excellent aspects that we'd love to share with this committee as well.
I did just want to clarify, at least from RSM's perspective, I mean, in all the conversations that we had with Scott as we were going through this process and the construction audit that we did back in 2019, there was nothing to suggest that Scott isn't capable and, doesn't have the requisite experience that we would expect from somebody in his position. I just wanted to, at least from RSM's perspective, but like I said, what Scott, how he was involved and what he was or wasn't told to do is, not for, I don't know, but and I think that's what some of that may come out in a response. And that was, to Scott's credit, why we actually requested, from the superintendent's office, the response, rather than just having, Scott to respond directly to this.
And just for everybody's clarity, Scott was a stand-up guy when Benita had their issue, and it took the heat that he deserved to take for it, but took it as a true professional. So I don't want to say that he danced around the comments. Where my concern comes in is exactly what Dr. Savage just said. If there was a control breakdown in this process, and this is $108 million project, where else do we have potentials where staff is saying, I don't understand why we have this control in place, so we really don't need it. We don't need the oversight. We don't need the secondary sign off. We don't need the dual control. We don't need that because, you know what, I'm just too busy in the day. I have 30 hours worth of work in a 8-hour workday. And I just want to make sure that the controls don't get lost. And that's more where my emotion is kicking in, because there was a lot of time spent on that flow chart and putting the controls in place. And then to find out that some of those controls may or may not have been followed to the level that they should have been, that's where my concern comes in for this. Hey, Mr. Sutton?
I was essentially just going to echo what you said, in that, at the end of the day, there's board decisions. That's policy. It's made by elected officials. The elected officials will be held accountable at the ballot box. Some of them may have already been held accountable at the ballot box for some of the elections and the changes that occurred. And so for the questions I'm asking, especially around the scope increase and the changes there, is at what level of detail was the district staff providing to the board? And if we find out that it was all there and they had all that information and the board made a decision that's, you know, personally, I think is bad policy, that this is not the venue to address bad policy. It needs to be focused on process. And so I think that's, we'll look forward to management's response on that.
Yes.
So, and just following up what Dr. Savage said, indicating that there will be improvements in the process. At the end of the day, who is responsible for implementing those improvements? Is it staff? Is it the board, the school board? And at the end of the day, will you list the exact improvements you see that are needed, required to ensure this doesn't happen going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it goes back to really what Mr. Cohen said related to the control environment. I think we have to look at all those aspects. I think we look at the audit committee. I think we look at our board. I think we look at our construction advisory. I think we look at our construction department, their leadership structure there. All of those aspects I think are fair game to look at because we do want the breakdowns. I think it starts with memorializing information. I think we have a lot of good information that we can base that judgment on. I think we're going to hone in on the areas where it was most problematic. And then we're going to kind of try to exploit where was the breakdown in the control environment? Where did that really happen? What should have occurred but did not occur? What could we do? Where would our prior process maybe insulate us, and where would it maybe have also been insufficient? I think we're wide open on those pieces because obviously there's a lot of intention to try to protect us from something like this. But that's all I can do is really try to unpack it. I was not involved in probably the most critical time period of there. I just had no real factual basis that I could respond to it. And so I just would say, I don't want to speculate. I'd rather allow the people who I know were there consistently through that I can probe a little bit deeper on that piece and say, why wasn't this followed on specific elements? And I think once I kind of have that, I'll know if we want to recommend any procedural changes on top of any policy level changes. But I just know that, you know, and Mr. Cohen said it, the whole situation of Benita High was something that scarred a lot of folks in our organization. So there was a lot of attention trying to address them. Where this was probably getting off on the wrong track right out of the gate was probably that master plan. It was this idea that we don't know what we don't know. We want to, because it isn't a simple, we want to build a new school, right? Because that in and of itself is complex, but just going into an existing site and trying to understand the dynamics of what you want to do there, how you want to do it, how you're going to adapt the environment based on the in session, all those other elements that go into that complexity, that invited such variance in the initial forecasting of what they might do, even though I'm very confident it was known that this was the amount of money they had today, but that before any additional depth was going on, it was going to be brought back. And that's what that initial design reflected was it was $40 million, but that was never intended to be the number that you would be tethered to. It was that first design drawing of the architect, 100%. That was designed to be the number that you would then act upon as an informed board.
So earlier, Mr. Cohen indicated his perspective in terms of when the public sees this and the public ire that it's gonna raise, be it one half penny tax or anything else. So does staff, does the board have a methodology to communicate this better to the community as to what happened and how it happened? And in reality is, this just didn't go from 40 million to 100 million because of cost overruns. There were substantial improvements made along the process, and the students have benefited from that. And that's gotta be communicated to the public so they understand exactly what happened here.
Yeah, if the 40 million was seed money to get the project started, cool. Then that's your spin. That's what you're saying. But, it's hard to know what it actually was, so.
Yeah, but that's, that's exactly, I would see they used maybe a different term. I would say that in the initial stages, they knew there was substantial work that had to occur at Riverdale. There are a lot of maintenance projects scheduled because of an aging facility. Instead of doing those as one-off separate projects, rolled them all together into a master site design, looking for optimization. What else can we do? Being more creative, asking an architect who knows exactly this is what they do professionally. They're analyzing the needs, they're listening to different groups, they're analyzing the site. The culmination of that is, this is your GMP, this is our 100% design estimate of what you're gonna need to do based on this scope, and bring that back to the board. Board now has a chance to react to that. Yep, we like it, 60 million, yeah, it's more than what we expected, but you see all the value that's created. I can't speak beyond that. That's where it ends. My only understanding ends at that point. I don't know what happened between there and the next big change. I just don't know. I can't say it, but we will have that information. We certainly have people who do know. They can share that, and that will be in the management response. But I invite this group. I'll be more than happy to have a member of those folks just to speak to it if any aspect of the management response is lacking. And to get additional guidance on procedural recommendations you may have, because the best thing is to learn from the experience the best we can. And I'm happy to have us do that so that we can have the taxpayer confidence that this was not a waste of money, that whatever value you see, and it spells out what was done. You can see what was done. Whether or not that equates to the amount of money that you think was a good expenditure of funds, I think unfortunately it's probably a matter of subjective, value in that. But I think from our standpoint, I want to be able to defend how we arrived where we are, at least explain what that is, and then improve our process.
Just because I heard it, I'm not sure if I'm reading this correctly. Did it go to the construction advisory committee in February?
So it was an informal discussion on February 1st, where we watched that video, and Scott Reckenbacher did communicate, again, informally, that it was going to cost an additional $30 million. That was the only instance where we saw that additional phase was communicated, and that additional $30 million.
So it was already like February 1st, 2023, was in front of construction advisory, informal, as I said, but all of their meetings are informal. And if they were discussing the $60 million, but there was an indication that there was going to be a 40% increase in cost, which would be the 30 million, bringing us up to about $90 million at that time in front of the advisory committee. Correct?
Right.
I just wanted to double check.
And just so everybody, full disclosure, Mr. Persons and I did speak about that. I don't know if the school board has been made knowledgeable about this audit report as of yet. And I'm going to ask Mr. Persons if he could ask of the school board, do we want to take Dr. Savage up on his offer of having a member of management available to speak to the audit committee before the school board meeting? So that this way, if the school board has any questions of the audit committee themselves and our comfort with management's responses, what transpired here, and do we feel that where the process breakdown occurred, we're knowledgeable enough to answer those questions.
No. When are we scheduled to do this? We have a set date.
The board briefing on June 3rd is when we would be presenting this.
Which is a very tight window. Right. And I don't know, Dr. Savage, if management will have the response available for the June 3rd.
That was the intent, to have it ready for that date. I mean, it's just going to speak to, we're acknowledging certainly the recommendations. That's the piece of it, but I just wanted to give you a more substantive opportunity to dig in on anything you have. Just some of the questions you have today, I think could have been answered had I had, Mr. Rickenbacker sitting here and so forth as well, because he was here. He was a part. I have that gap that I can't speak to. He would not have had that gap. Would have the answers to those things.
I would say let's stay on the time period we have. Let them go ahead and report to us, and then we'll come back when both sides have been fully briefed. And then let you come before the board or whatever, when you can also see what they're reporting on the responses when you get those.
But I think also for your benefit, Mr. Parsons, with what Dr. Savage just said, in case there are no responses in writing, at least Mr. Rickenbacker can be available to discuss any of your concerns from this report with the school board as well.
And he's very accessible. I think that won't be a problem. They will be able to work with superintendent on that.
Are there any other questions relating to the Riverdale High School audit? With that, I'm going to request that we go into executive session. And also, we are at 7:00, which is our usual hard stop. I'll entertain a motion to extend this meeting. I don't know if we need an additional hour. I'd rather be a little conservative and say an additional hour. If we get done earlier, that would be wonderful. Till 8:00, so I'll entertain that motion.
Carol, you just moved up, extend the meeting till the determination of the chair.
Can I get a second on that? All in favor? Aye. Unanimously approved. At this stage, I'm going to ask everybody, since this is a confidential report, everybody please put your phones away. Reminder, whatever this report is not to be shared.
Do you want to do your verbiage about closed session before I stop recording?
Yep, I'll take it off. Yeah. Have one?
And just so everybody is aware, each report has a number on it. So that is their control to ensure that they get every one of these reports back. I will leave that to you. Bruno, are you comfortable with giving a copy of this report? For confidentiality?
This one's annotated. That one.
Here. This is about physical security, and we need to have, it's a closed session,
Okay.
so I think we need to be.
Amy's coming back, so she'll leave the restroom.
So my recommendation, Mr. Chairman, since this is a closed session, only the individuals who are either part of the audit committee are supposed to participate in this closed session. So I don't really think that our internal auditor or CFO, since this is just about security, needs to be in attendance for this particular meeting. Although I know that Ms. Densmore does serve in a capacity on the audit committee, so I'll leave that to you, Mr. Chairman, and tell you anything.
I will leave this to Dr. Savage. Your staff's duties, roles, within all of us. And if you feel that it's appropriate for those members of staff to be present, I'm comfortable with it. If you feel that it is best for them to leave the room.
Yeah, I would acknowledge the attorney's recommendation and excuse Mr. Gatewood and Dr. Desmond. We can just let her be aware that I don't use anything with her. So that we can continue on that because I don't see the need for them to participate. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
With that, I will leave it to RSM for your presentation. Once Mr. Gatewood leaves the room.
Okay.
And John, we are silenced.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So you'll see a couple reports. The first report is going to be the public report. This is the report that will be issued just for your reference. We've included this so that you have visibility to this because of the confidential nature of the report. We wanted you to have access to what the public will ultimately have access to. With that, I will give a brief overview and then I'll pass it to Jack, who led this engagement. This specific audit of physical security was a desk audit, right? So our focus was really about evaluating compliance
with existing statute and policy regarding physical security protocols, procedures, and some of the reporting requirements that are expected of the district. If I can just briefly begin on page 2, Jeff will walk us through specifically what we were trying to achieve, including our objectives, our scope, and a little bit of background as to why we scoped what we did, what exactly we were looking to achieve through this. Overall, the summary, I'd say, was very favorable. So very, very happy, very pleased to have worked with David's team on this. We have one moderate finding. And again, I think this moderate finding will ultimately serve as an opportunity to enhance the already strong control environment that exists as it relates to physical security within the district. So with that, I'll pass it to Jack, who will walk us through the report.
Perfect. Thank you, Ice. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jack Hughes. I was the project lead in this internal audit of physical security. I work very closely with the team seated here today, working with a variety of school districts around the state and a variety of operational performance and compliance audits. On report page 2, as Weiss said, I'd like to just quickly walk us through our objectives and scope before getting into some of the background, and then ultimately we will finish with our moderate observation noted as part of this review. What did we look at? We looked at, as Weiss said, this was a desk audit. We looked at the dissemination of information processes. We looked at the reporting and how that information was communicated, deficiencies as they were identified through the risk assessment process, which I will walk us through briefly in just a minute, how that information was communicated and ultimately remediated and reported on. Our background of the report, starting in that top
in public, but not, maybe not in detail. So yeah, we do share things with reports with the board. In fact, our House Bill 1473 is coming out. There is a requirement on a quarterly basis, all non-compliance issues are to be reported quarterly to the board and the public. So that's part of the future report as well. They'll be advised, anything we see or identified by safe schools.
Any other questions?
So that is all that we had, unless you all had any additional questions. We can start to collect these. Yeah, if you want to go that way.
All right. Anyway,
That's the last one, right?
Just the one marked confidential.
sorry.
And please, anybody with the notes, the notes that I was in my notes right on here.
Yeah, those related through 6.
Yeah.
I got 7. Plus.
I have the t-shirt. Yeah, here's two.
Going to be back.
It looks like it.
Let the minutes reflect that all reports were delivered and back to RSM and the accountant for all reports. Right. Are there any other questions for RSM at this time? With that, let's close that section. Any old business that we need to discuss? Any new business? Yes, Mr. Wood.
Dawn, were we going to discuss that?
Yeah.
posting?
Matt, Mr. Ward had a question about, he received the calendar invite for his one-on-one, but he doesn't see a Zoom link.
Okay,
I can look at
we will fix that.
I'm sorry.
We will fix that.
Okay.
I'll look at that.
And everybody else, I'm assuming you received their invites? Any other questions for RSM relating to any of the processes coming forward? Mr. Wood, any other questions?
No.
To new business? Okay, we all know that for our next meeting, we want to be prepared to have discussion around the job description. So I don't know if everybody's had a chance to go back through it. Dr. Savage, did you have a chance to put any of your notes together from our last meeting?
No, I don't have anything to share with you today. Just that I had someone else, also just trying to pay attention, was that we've assigned it now to our HR division. So that they have that piece. They're going to be working with our business services to continue to take feedback from the group, as well as work with our board to incorporate feedback and different models and suggestions. But really, that's work that we anticipate we're trying to complete by the end of this summer to ensure that if the board wishes to move forward, that we have a good structure and good job description in place. So we'll continue that engagement throughout the summer to get it where it is. Because we didn't have a clear owner in the organization for that work. But that any job description of any kind really lives in our HR. That's also viewed as an organizational chart, supports with that. So that's that primary piece of it. But because our business services division is also related to the compliance side, so that's one of the things that emerged as a theme today of how are we ensuring we're compliant with what we're doing? How are we checking? That's really where our current internal audit department resides in terms of our internal side. And so we just want to continue to have them participate as well, since that's an area of knowledge that they can contribute as well.
Thank you. Mr. Persons, I know that there is a deliverable due to the school board. We were hoping before the end of the summer for the school board to make a determination whether to put that out for.
Right. Another board would most likely like to do it sooner than later. This was seem to be their wishes. I do want to also mention on reports, I believe we're going to be talking whether you have to give them in person or you can just present a report. It'll be up to the chair, or some chairs don't want to come there and do a report live, and they really don't need to, so. So we're going to be given that option too. I just want to let you know that was coming. That would be a good time.
Yeah, because I believe that this is the only committee that doesn't, advisory committee does not
do a presentation to the school board. Or to the superintendent for that matter. Okay, anything else for good of the order?
Mr. Chair, move adjourn.
Sure, I can ask one question.
Yes.
If it's possible, and maybe this isn't the right time, but to identify a date for the next meeting. If we're happy to circle back, but I know that that'll be important for delivery of the remaining audit plan. We'll have about 5 reports, I believe, of the next meeting, so. Something to consider, I think, from our timeline, from our perspective, mid-July is probably the timeline that we're looking at. So if it's good for the chair, we can provide dates to Dawn and we can have those distributed for you, for the committee to review.
Yes, if you could, please provide that
Might be
to us.
easier. Yeah, so you have adequate time to look at it. Okay, we'll do that after this meeting then.
And if everybody remembers, we were going to try to have a meeting early June to discuss the job description as well. If everybody could please advise Dawn of availability.
Thanks.
Thank you. And with that, I'll have the motion to adjourn.
So
Second, please. Minutes reflect that we adjourned at 7:40.
Turned up the heat in here. Purposely.
Oh, thank God. I thought it was just me. When you opened at 5:32, who's moved to accept the minutes and second? I was trying to get rid of my husband on the phone.
The minutes.
Minutes, Jim. And you said, okay. I wasn't too far off.
If you need any help getting anything stable, I know.
Yeah, if y'all could help, yes, that would be awesome.
Matching the diagram on the wall over there.
They go 3, 3, 3, 3.
Yeah, I think so.
I think there's 4 rows of 3, I think.
I appreciate it.
Thank you for everything.
You. Okay. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Very appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Try not to talk.
No. Back, huh? I thought. That's Andy and Phil. Yeah. Okay.